I'm live streaming this for everybody. I'm going to say hello to them so that they have a proper introduction, and then we'll all dive in together too. So hi everybody in Facebook land. Giving a talk tonight called Life After Ayahuasca, Putting the Messages of the Medicine into Practice. And I'm with a lovely group of people here tonight, actually in a library, which is cool. And we're hanging out and we're going to talk about ayahuasca. So yeah, so hi everybody. And I just want to, hi. A show of hands, how many people here have actually had an experience with ayahuasca already? Okay. So it seems like maybe over half have actually had. How many of you are thinking about it if you haven't? Thinking, okay, right. Okay, good. Well, I mean, anyone who's been here and who's done it, you can be like, if someone's like, would you recommend it? You're like, maybe? Yeah, yes. No, you know, it's kind of a back and forth thing because it's a very personal experience, and it's a very sacred and deep and transformative and sometimes very terrifying experience. So it's hard to recommend it to anybody, but I think that it really helps to have community places like this where you can talk about it, you can hear people's stories, and humanize it a little bit, because ayahuasca, since I went, I started going in 2005 to Peru. And then I worked with the medicine very regularly over the course of about a decade, all the way up until about 2015. I consider myself on a sabbatical right now. So the experience, though, when I first started, I remember when I was in Iquitos then compared to what it was like, I don't know, 6 years later or something like that. And a huge amount of centers had blossomed up in that time. And it was already growing increasingly popular when I first went. I was maybe a couple of months before I had first gone, there was a National Geographic article that came out talking about a lodge that I went to. It's called the Blue Morpho Lodge. And it had impressed me so much, and I was at a pretty unique turning point in my life. I think that's where a lot of people find their way to the medicine, or even just starting to think about it. It's often a sign that there's something deeper that's happening in your life, you know. But I grew up a preacher's kid in the church, and when I was in college, I was studying, hopefully, to be a minister. My father started experiencing severe burnout in the ministry. It was like mental, psychological, just real, so even spiritual, just exhaustion working in the Christian church. And so his kind of existential situation and his job situation coincided with, I guess, the beginning of my own questioning of my faith upbringing. And from that space, I was a youth minister of a Methodist church in Chicago, and then I left my job because I realized that I wasn't sure if I could actually continue on to be a source of ministry for kids when I didn't know that I really believed anything that I was saying. Do you know what it was a pretty kind of deep moment. And so then, of course, the natural thing that came in to that space was the other holy trinity of drugs, sex, and rock and roll, you know. So kind of just went went off into that direction for a little bit. And I quickly got wrapped up in opiate addiction, which it's interesting now that I look at the national opiate kind of crisis, and I think to myself, gosh, I feel like I remember when it was getting started, when I would feel like I was a young person who was getting hooked on opiates. And I never got into heroin or the really hard stuff, but I got really hooked on Oxycontin, which a lot of kids are hooked on these days. So it was really problematic for me. But it went along with basically just not knowing how to have a social identity outside of the church and outside of being really identified with the doctrines and teachings of the church I grew up in, just having identity that was really immersed in that world. And by chance, during that period of time, I had a psychedelic experience with mushrooms, and I thought I was going to have fun. Like, this is going to be like, like, yeah, I'll take that. Like, oh, let's just get high. It'll be great. And then, before I knew it, I locked myself into my bedroom. It was a party that was going on at my own apartment, and I locked myself into my bedroom and basically had this really intense episode where I realized that every article of clothing, like things that were on my shelf, everything was directly related to my father. And it was like a Sudoku puzzle or something. Like, oh, it was a crazy experience. I was like, it was all coming. I was like, God, everything's so heavy with my dad, and I also remembered that there were all sorts of pieces of clothing that I wanted to really love and couldn't get rid of because I thought, eventually I'll really like this. Have you ever had that with a shirt or something? Or so you buy, you're like, I should like this shirt. I should like it, but then you just can't. So I had this really deep experience of putting on the clothing that I couldn't love myself in or couldn't like or something like that, and just it's really making peace with it. And it was crazy. Now that I think back at it, I'm like, what a crazy experience that was. But I think more than anything, what it opened up in me was this very, very powerful direct connection to spirit. And a connection to the life of the psyche, really, which even though I grew up in a religious environment, I don't think I was necessarily in touch with. And it also showed me how much is sitting right before our eyes that we don't always see or feel. How much we don't see or feel because our hearts are closed, or we aren't really taking the time to see and think and feel. And it was so powerful and so scary, really, because I would go back out, people were drinking, listening to music, and I was like, there's catchphrases like low vibrations or whatever, but it was like literal, it was like a bass note was just vibrating in the other part of my apartment, and I was like, that's the life I've created. Like, oh my God, and so I'm in my bedroom, and I just, as peaceful as I had my lamp lit and I burned incense, and I was just hiding in the corner with my clothing. And so at any rate, you can imagine, but afterward, I think what this experience did for me was it gave me a sense of spiritual hope again, or spiritual interest or curiosity. You know what I mean? It just lit something. And of course, for a little bit, I thought that the answer was recreational psychedelics. Let's just do more of this and see where it goes. That didn't work very well, for starters, because it's like a grab bag. You don't know what you're gonna get. You know what I mean? And I had some really terrifying experiences that I think were probably much more traumatizing than anything else. Also, some really amazing, eye-opening experiences doing a lot of different psychedelic drugs. And but it was mixed. It was mixed with the same kind of party scene and stuff like that. Somewhere along the way, this is a really funny coincidence, but my father gave me a book. He had gotten back into a hobby of his from when he was a kid. He was listening to a shortwave radio he used to have when he was a kid. He got back into shortwave radios again. And somehow he ended up picking up, I think it was Coast to Coast. Have you guys ever heard that show? So he ended up picking up Coast to Coast. You can imagine my father, who's kind of going through a midlife, do I want to be a minister anymore, suddenly dialed into Coast to Coast on a shortwave radio in the garage while he doesn't know his son is tripping. And this other, it's like, and so it was this very interesting parallel path that the two of us were on. And he heard about this book called Breaking Open the Head by Daniel Pinchbeck. Have any of you read it before? It's a very interesting book that catalogs this journalist's exploration of psychedelic experiences. At any rate, he heard about it, and he got interested in the book. He ordered it, and then he had it sitting around for a while. And then at some point, I started sharing with him my psychedelic experiences, sort of openly, as he was kind of openly sharing where he was at with burnout from ministry. And he said, well, I got this book, and he gave it to me. And the first chapter was about iboga, which is very similar to ayahuasca. It's from West Africa. And it's a similar deep psychedelic purgative plant medicine. And it was just, I was with a friend, and we were reading about it while having a really bad experience on a psychedelic drug. Like, I had it sitting on the shelf for a while, and we were tripping out. And I was like, maybe if I read something, it'll help us stay grounded. And I happened to pick up this book off the shelf that my father happened to give me from a shortwave radio, like we could just think about how crazy that is, right? And the first chapter was about iboga, and the whole nature of the experience that we were having shifted. It was as though, even though we were not consuming iboga or ayahuasca or something like that, just the fact that there was a sacred context with guides, with people who knew how to maneuver through these experiences, that it existed out there, calmed us. It was pretty amazing. And that trip was really one of the final experimental sort of psychonautic surf trips that I ever went on. At which point my friend who was with me got really excited about going to Peru to drink ayahuasca, because the book also contained some stories about ayahuasca. And he did some research and found out, that this was a thing. So in the meantime, the psychedelic experiences had led me away from my downward spiral, was starting to actually get a little bit more sober, gradually. It was a process. But at that time, the first thing that happened was sort of getting out of the party scene and deciding to go back to graduate school. So instead of being a youth minister anymore and sort of being in this weird limbo state where I was just doing a lot of partying and working at restaurants and kind of didn't have a sense of where I was going, I decided to go back to grad school. And the psychedelic experiences were very central to that, because they gave me a very clear sense that what I was most passionate about was writing, creative writing. Because after some of these psychedelic experiences that I had, the first ones, I returned to my love for writing really for the first time since high school. I had always, since I was a kid, I wrote, and I won some contests, and my teachers were always kind of encouraging me to write creative stories because I really loved it. And so I decided, this is what I love, and the psychedelics gave me some kind of audaciousness because before I don't think I ever would have thought, go get a master's degree in creative writing. I think before I would have been like, who's dumb enough to do that? You know what I mean? Total waste of time. You're never going to get a job, whatever. So, but I think something has shifted in me where I was audacious and I was feeling like nothing else matters but doing what's really in your heart. And that's something genuine that psychedelics gave me even prior to ayahuasca. And if that's something that comes out of a psychedelic experience, whether it's in this really traditional sacred kind of container or not, I think it's a good thing. But I'm always a little skeptical now, and I always kind of talk down recreational experiences with psychedelics because I think that sometimes they really traumatize people. I know that I had part of my ayahuasca journeys over 10 years was actually doing some cleaning of trauma from previous psychedelic experiences. So that's why I kind of say that. But at any rate, so I went back to graduate school, and my parents had built a retirement home on my grandparents' land, and so they let me stay there as I went to graduate school for creative writing. Well, my friend, like I said, was sort of fired up about the idea of going to Peru. In the meantime, I was trying to construct some kind of independent study that would allow me to do travel writing abroad somewhere, just because I wanted to travel mostly, so. And my friend suggested, that I go to Peru with him. And at first I was actually really resistant to it. I was like, it's crazy that you're going to go and do that, because from the sounds of it, this was very terrifying potentially, maybe really good for you, but wow. So at any rate, but he convinced me because we've been best friends. In fact, he's coming out to see me next week. We've been best friends since the 4th grade. So it was like, if he's going to do it, I've got to do it. You know what I mean? So it's like, okay, so I'm going to go to Peru. So I ended up getting a travel writing independent study approved. So I could use loans, school, the federal student loans to go. Actually, something that the government really helped me with. So I used my federal student loans to go to Peru and drink ayahuasca, and that's how it started. In the meantime, I'll make a long story short and just give you the arc. The experiences with ayahuasca were just mind-blowing. I mean, just completely life-changing. Still, the most singularly important event of my life was the first time that I drank ayahuasca in the jungle. I can't think of anything else that compares to it. So those experiences started, they put me on a path with ayahuasca for, like I said, about a decade. And it would become a very deep teacher and ally for me. And it's kind of a little deceptive to say ayahuasca became an ally, because really once you drink ayahuasca, you know very well that there's multitudinous plant spirits that are really your allies. It's not just one singular entity. The medicine is a singular thing, but it's also made up of sentient plant spirits that are very active in helping you clean and grow in consciousness, you could say. So at any rate, so that process began. I'll talk more about the experiences in a little bit, but I want to give you the sense of the arc of my story a little bit more. So after those initial experiences, when I came back, within about 3 months and one small relapse, I completely was sober. So it was, it's, as many people say, and as many people know, it's a remarkable healer for addiction. A lot of people with addiction, all sorts of things, but addiction in particular, it was very, very effective at helping me get away from Oxycontin, methadone, morphine, Vicodin. I mean, stuff I was taking every day. So, and alcohol, nicotine, that all of that also left. Soda, sugar, alcohol, caffeine, like all of that was either gone or greatly, greatly reduced. Those are some of the immediate physical benefits, I would say, or physical healings that I experienced. That's not to say that when I say things like caffeine and nicotine and alcohol and things like that, I'll qualify those comments a little bit later. I want to go a little bit more deeply into lifestyle and how coming back into the world after ayahuasca, some of the things that the medicine teaches and some of the best ways to keep what the medicine teaches alive in your life relative to lifestyle choices. So I want to qualify that remark a little bit, because I don't want to sound like once a person drinks ayahuasca, they'll never have a glass of wine again, or they'll, whatever. But at any rate, coming back, again, over the course of the next 10 years, drinking a lot of ayahuasca and continuing the healing journey, I guess you could say. I developed the travel log into my master's thesis. The master's thesis won Creative Thesis of the Year at my university for my master's program, and was part of what helped me earn a fellowship to a Master of Fine Arts degree at another university, continuing to study creative writing, specifically now focusing on spiritual memoir. And then I went to that school in Georgia and continued going back and forth to Peru, and then writing the first draft of this book, Fishers of Men, The Gospel of an Ayahuasca Vision Quest. I'll show this today. So the inspiration for this book came not only through the continued experiences with the medicine, but the parallel story of generational healing that was taking place with my father and my grandfather at the same time. So my father ended up getting out of church work during this period of time. And by the end of the time this book was written, was in Peru drinking ayahuasca as well. So my sister ended up going as well. So it was very remarkable family sort of healing that took place, especially around some of the heavier, I think, complicated themes of Christian faith that we all grew up with. And my grandfather also, unbeknownst to me, while I was stealing his Oxycontin, my grandfather was also becoming addicted to it himself. And so my grandfather also ended up in a nursing home, not so much because he needed to, but because he had developed an Oxycontin addiction while I was having one too. And he ended up having kind of a nervous breakdown that would really put him in a nursing home far earlier than he needed to be. And that was happening at the same time that my father was leaving the ministry and going through his own healing journey for sure. And that I was also going through this kind of experience. So it was that story is interwoven in this book with the ayahuasca stories. So that's what my book ended up being about. That's what I developed in my Master of Fine Arts program. And then when I was in the last year of my Master of Fine Arts program, remember the original author I mentioned, Daniel Pinchbeck, in his book, Breaking Open the Head. I continued following his work. He ended up writing a book called 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. Maybe you've heard of this. And another book that he wrote that was pretty popular at the time. He and some other artists and writers from New York City were starting a web magazine called Reality Sandwich. And they put out a call on the internet at the time for bloggers, and blogging was still kind of becoming a thing, you know what I mean? And I had a live journal that I started writing in back when I first started doing psychedelics. This had developed over 5 or 6 years. And I had just developed like an online following of my creative writing. And I didn't know anyone who was, at that time, there weren't like comments and social profiles and, you know what I mean? Like it was just how many people read, you could see how many people viewed it or something like, it was very simple. And I just thought, I think this blogging thing is really cool. And this web magazine is looking for bloggers and writers to write content about consciousness and psychedelics and comparative religious studies and the environment and stuff like that. So I was like, hey, that sounds really cool. Plus I liked Daniel Pinchbeck's work. So I just auditioned basically. And I'm pretty sure they were taking anyone who could write off the street, basically, who also maybe had these experiences, who understood these experiences. And I ended up going during my MFA program. They're sort of like MFA programs, even though they're supposed to be about creative writing. They're sort of like grooming you to be like college English professors, basically. So it's not, and then the success of your writing is really defined by publishing in academic journals that 10 people read, and there's a small kind of group of people that, do you know what I mean? All of academics is sort of like that, and I was really disillusioned by it. So at any rate, not to slam anybody so much, just to say it just wasn't my cup of tea. And so we were in New York City for a writers or a kind of an English convention, like teachers and writers and stuff like that. So I was at that convention. I was supposed to be mingling with other meeting people and doing that kind of thing. And it was in New York City, so I ended up taking off to go hang out with the Reality Sandwich people, because I had landed a writing gig and I was like, these are the people I really want to be hanging out with. And while I was hanging out with them in New York City, basically kind of started developing a little bit of a friendship with them and just planting the seed of like, I don't want to go into English. I want to move to New York City and somehow get involved with these people and consciousness and psychedelics and spiritual, this is really, really exciting time. Anyway, they ended up inviting me to come back to New York City almost right before I graduated from my MFA to do a talk, tell some stories about my ayahuasca experiences at this a show that was called the Ayahuasca Monologues. And has anybody heard of the Ayahuasca Monologues before? Okay, cool. So I ended up sharing a story at the Ayahuasca Monologues, and then just because I got to meet more people at Reality Sandwich and things like that, I said, you know, I'm writing a book about this too, because they really liked the story. And they had sort of been like, well, you know, what we're thinking of is we're thinking of trying to publish some of the authors that write for our website and their unique content. Because Daniel, who's one of the founders, has a lot of good literary agency and publishing house connections, like trying to make an imprint, so Reality Sandwich imprint or something like that. Ended up being called Evolver Books, which you can see at the top here. And you may have heard of also the Evolver social network, which was a big thing for a little while. I'm not sure. I don't think there's an Evolver, actually an Evolver location in New York City you can go to now. It's like a interesting kind of juice bar, and there's a lot of cool talks that happen there and stuff. But at any rate, they said, well, yeah, submit your book, you know. And so after grad school, instead of going to, and I'm still going back and forth drinking a lot of ayahuasca, instead of going to become an English teacher, I remember going on some of the interviews in just these lonely little community colleges, and I was just like, oh my God, like this can't be happening. I didn't want it. There was no way I was going to be able to do it, because I just had my heart in New York City. That's really where I wanted to go. And so I went to Peru, and in a ceremony, I was drinking in just before my graduation and just after the ayahuasca monologues. I was sitting next to a therapist from New York City, a doctor who I just was really open to him about how I wanted to be close to Reality Sandwich in New York, and I wanted to find some different avenue for using my writing and things like that. And during the ceremony, he turns over to me in the middle of the ceremony and goes, I think I have a job for you in New York. And I was like, okay. So I was really excited, you know. I mean, you can imagine, like, that was a nice thing to hear during the middle of an ayahuasca ceremony. So you're doing this deep inner work, and so, like, I have a job for you in New York. And I was like, that's awesome. That's just totally helped make my experience a little bit easier right now in this minute. Probably 10 minutes later, I was in a bucket again. But anyway, so no, the next day, he told me that he worked at a residence home that was run by the Franciscans, and that they were looking to hire. He knew that there was an activities therapist that was leaving. Art and activities therapist that worked with the adult schizophrenics who live in this residence home that's run by the Franciscans. And he said they don't like hiring people with MSWs, the Master of Social Work, because they find them uppity. So they want people who just care and who are artists. And that's the kind of person they like to fill in. And he was kind of joking about it. I said, well, that's me, because I have no credentials as a social worker, but I'm creative and I care. So I'd love to go do something like that. And I'd worked, of course, at youth camps and as in mentorship stuff in the inner city. So I had some background in working with people, I guess, you know. But at any rate, he said, you know, I can try to get you an interview. I'm not sure when it will be. And meanwhile, my school year is ending in a couple of weeks, and I gotta do something, you know. So I just sold all my stuff and moved to New York City like a crazy person, you know. I'm just going, and I'm just, you know, it's like a bad Bon Jovi song. I'm just driving in a car up to New York, just like, it's gonna work. But it did. I got the job, and so I was at the residence home for a while. Started working with ayahuasca group that was in the city. So I started, you know, drinking in the United States, and then eventually started working with the Santa Daime, which is a spiritual ayahuasca community from Brazil, and submitted my book after I got, you know, I was there for a little bit, maybe a little less than a year, when I finally finished a draft that I wanted to give to them, and they were ready to start taking publications from the authors at Reality Sandwich. I remember as the offer came in for the book, my father was in the jungle drinking ayahuasca. So it was very synchronistic and beautiful. And then the name of the book came. I was going back and forth about the name. The name of the book came in a ceremony one time. It was really cool. So then the book came out. Finally, that was 2009. The book came out in 2010. And then I left the ayahuasca. I won't go into this too much, but basically somewhere in there, ayahuasca started really turning all of my attention and love toward astrology. I just started, it was a language that started coming through my experiences. A lot of people have that happen. Like they'll find something that they're really naturally dialed into. Yoga and astrology started just pouring through the experiences for me. I started getting really dialed into yoga in New York City and studying astrology and stuff like that. In 2010, I shifted out of the social work and started a career as an astrologer after a series of eclipses happened in my birth chart that landed on my natal sun and moon, and coincided with about 4 days worth of a really intense fever, which I ended up going. It was the weirdest thing because it wasn't like a normal fever. You know, it was a kind of, you know, when you're just going through a lot, like you've moved or there's a big life change and you're sick, but it's like spirit sick. It's like, no, it's no medicine. It's just a transition that you're going through and your body's just reacting to it. It was that kind of sickness. And I had this intuition that I needed to drink ayahuasca, which sounds crazy. And it's not probably a good thing to drink ayahuasca when you're having a fever. In general, I wouldn't advise it. But for whatever reason, I thought that it would be a good idea. And so I went and drank ayahuasca, and it actually broke my fever. It was incredible. It actually, like, immediately, within like 2 hours, it broke my fever. I was laid out because I was so exhausted from the fever. But as I was sort of laid out, you know, on the ground, this was actually the day after an eclipse. The fever broke, and then I received the vision that it was time to leave my job, and it was time to start being an astrologer. The same kind of feeling that I got when I knew I needed to start writing. You know, like, doesn't matter, don't, just do what's in your heart, just go for it. So the day my book came out, I started my astrology practice. I filed the paperwork for my LLC on the day my book came out, and then yeah, somehow I've been supported in doing astrology full time since, and that was, you know, 8 years ago. So I'm a full-time astrologer. My astrology practice was born in the medicine space. My wife and I own a yoga studio. My yoga practice was born in the medicine space. And then I consider myself a writer too, but writing's a hard gig to, you know. So I write daily horoscopes. I'm very blessed to be able to write every single day. I write astrological content every single day, but all of that came from the medicine. So that in many ways, from the age of, you know, so I'm 37 right now. This started for me at 22 to 23 years old. So, I mean, really, like, it was my coming of age kind of story with the medicine, and the whole path that my life has taken from, you know, who I married. I married an herbalist who works with plant spirits and does yoga and has drank ayahuasca too. And we started a yoga studio. Just so many choices that I never would have made if it weren't for the direction and guidance of the medicine. So I wanted to tell you all that story because, to me, there's really nothing in the world that you could say to summarize the experiences of ayahuasca. Do you know what I mean? They're so diverse, they're so healing, they're so scary, there's so many different things. But I think sometimes what the real testimony of astrology is the way that it changes our lives. What kind of life we start living when ayahuasca comes in, what kind of choices we make, what kind of daring decisions we make, what chances we take that we might not have otherwise, even if they don't work out. You know what I mean? Just the risk of putting our heart out there more regularly, of following something inside. Those are the things that I think, more than anything, those are the important stories to share about ayahuasca, because yes, it healed addiction, and yes, it gave me a lot of sort of practical physical healings and a lot of other, like, psychological healing, you could say. But I don't consider it to be the case where, well, because I got healed, then I was able to do things that were successful. Do you know what I mean? I think sometimes we sort of think that, well, you know, like there's a lot of stories, like, you know, even on talk shows and whatever, the model is like, well, you know, I was so lost, but then I got found and then I got successful. Do you know what I mean? And I think that even that story is not the real story with ayahuasca, because it really, one of the best gifts that ayahuasca gives you is the courage to fail, the courage to be able to fail, because failing with heart ends up being way better than, you know, going down a path where you might succeed but not with any heart. And so I don't look at anything that I've done from the medicine as necessarily, I don't feel like empowered by the medicine. I don't feel successful because of the medicine. I just feel that more than anything, ayahuasca put courage in my heart, and a sort of a sort of disregard for what the outcomes might be. So just so long as I follow my heart. You know, I think I think that's the practical takeaway. But I want to talk now about just a few things that I've noticed after being in the ayahuasca world for a long time, that I ended up directing the ayahuasca monologues for a number of years and getting to hear a lot of stories from people, and helping people learn to craft stories about the medicine to tell to others and stuff like that. And there are some really interesting things that are so basic about ayahuasca that get overlooked because of what a powerful experience it is. It's as though surrounding the experience of drinking ayahuasca is this dazzling effulgence, right? It's so bright and amazing and otherworldly. It's so numinous. Do you know what I mean? And people then get lost in the cloud of that numinosity, right? And so you can get lost in the spectacle of ayahuasca. It's very easy to get lost in stories about ayahuasca and stories about, you know, just sort of the cultural woo that surrounds it all, for lack of a better word. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so these are some of the most basic things that I think ayahuasca teaches and shows us, and these are some of the most basic ways to apply what it teaches and shows us. First and foremost, again, just to reiterate, I think it teaches us the importance that the most vital wellspring of life and love and goodness is in our hearts. And it's there at all times, at any moment, to access, to live from, to make decisions from. It's the source of all intelligence. It's the seed of who we really are. And it guides us if we listen to it. And it's an art and a skill and work to learn how to listen to it. But if you do, it won't matter what the results are. It's just about listening and being in that space and following that intelligence in your life. And I think that's, again, just like if I had to summarize it, like that would be the way that I would summarize it. But then there are also really basic, like sort of philosophical things that it teaches that you really can't underestimate how powerful they are. Like, number one, you're not your body. Like a lot of people believe that, you know what I mean? Like a lot of people are like, well, I know that I'm a spirit soul, or I'm going to live on after I die, or that I've been here before, or that I may be here again, or something like that. Like, I think for a lot of people, they go like, yeah, I believe that. Like, there was a survey that was done recently of professional astrologers, and it was like 60 or 70% or something like that of these 500 that were surveyed that believed in reincarnation, for example. And even there was a survey that was done, I'm going to forget it now. There was another survey that was done that was asking, just like Americans who believed in an afterlife. And regardless of any kind of religious background or affiliation, it was like a majority of people that believed in an afterlife, right? So like I think most people believe that there's something to us beside this body that will fall away at some point. But one of the most profound things in the world that ayahuasca delivers is like empirical evidence that it's actually true. Like, because you see it in a way that you can't unsee. You have an experience that you are not your body, and it's just mind-blowing. And I feel like sometimes it's such a simple thing that it actually gets overlooked. We talk a lot about how you get purged of demons, and you do cleansing, and you get your energy straight, and like all of that kind of stuff. But so many of my experiences, the most profound blessing, the thing that set everything straight, the thing that aligned all energies, the thing that put me back in my heart, was the simple awareness that I'm an eternal spirit soul. I was never born, truly, and I'm never going to die. Like, if you just take that in an ayahuasca experience for even 30 seconds, doesn't matter what else happens in the ceremony. It doesn't matter what comes after the ceremony. It doesn't matter what came before the ceremony. And I don't want to be overly reductionist, but it can be that beautiful and that simple. It's just like, hey, you're eternal, don't forget. Like, what do I even, what do you even do with that? Well, that's why people sit around and say things like, oh, because that's what it feels like. When you realize it, you're just like, what else is there to do but just be radically in awe and feeling gratitude for who you actually are. So I always like to say that one of the most amazing things that ayahuasca can bless us with is a very simple realization that you're not the body, that you're a spirit soul. And so many complicated ideas about what ayahuasca does or what it accomplishes or what the experiences deliver or whatever can be, in my experience, can be just completely overshadowed by some of the simplest moments like that. That's not to say that the other ones aren't important, obviously, but so the other thing, another simple realization that comes in the medicine space is the realization that although I am eternal, I am experiencing things in the material world, that this is a realm of some kind that we're in, and that the experiences that we have here are largely created by choices that we make, because we actually have free will. We have free will, and to a certain extent, our reality is created by choices that we make, especially habitual choices that we make that are subtle and small over and over again over a long period of time. That's a very basic truth that ayahuasca delivers a lot, because you'll have simple things like, okay, I remember one of my first ceremonies, I was basically saying, the medicine was sort of being like, hey, did you know that you basically haven't hydrated yourself properly for a couple of years? And I just remember being like, holy shit, I need to drink water. Like, this is serious. Like, I got to drink water. And look, so simple, right? And so much of my experience, my consciousness changed when I started drinking water rather than soda. Do you know what I mean? Like, and then just looking around the world and how many people drink soda all the time and aren't drinking water. And thinking about that in the ceremony literally broke my heart open. Do you know what I mean? I can still feel it when I think back about it. Like, just the realization that what I was feeling in my body, starving for water and didn't even know it, that millions of people around the planet are experiencing that because of consumerism and all of this stuff, and the way that just shatters your heart open. It's just it was just amazing. But behind that is the simple realization that small choices not to drink water, being habituated to drinking soda or coffee or whatever, Starbucks or whatever else, over time, those slow choices had created a total atmosphere of unconsciousness in my life it was linked to things that I was feeling in my body, to patterns of thinking in my head, to, you know what I mean? And when I started drinking water, those patterns changed. My health changed, my body, you know what I mean? Like, everything changed. But again, over time, what I learned was seeing so many of those patterns over time, like so many realizations about small things, habitual choices that were creating a quality of consciousness or a reality around me and in my mind and in my relationships and everything else. The simple realization was that my choices matter. My choices matter, and that every choice in every day matters. And usually in much smaller moments than we're aware of is where in yoga, we would say Maya slips in, a sort of sleepiness where we drift off. And when we let that slip in over and over and over again, we're being pulled along, and everything that we think is free will is not free at all. It's something else. We're being lived by patterns and powers. And this is why Jung said that the gods have become our diseases, right? Because when we're not in a conscious relationship with the forces around us, they just take over. That's what happens. They just work themselves out through our vehicle, and we become a slave to what their will is. And whereas when we start making choices, that's when we become actual agents. That's when our spirit souls start waking up and becoming luminous in the body. That's like a really, really, really simple thing, though, is to realize that we have choice in every day, in every moment, and that our choices matter, and that they lead to larger systemic changes in all areas of our life. So in that sense, the reality of karma is like, you're not your body, and there's this thing called karma. And the basic idea of karma is cause and effect. The Greeks called it praxis. There's ideas for it in lots of different places in the world, but it's the idea that your choices over time snowball into effects. And those effects are always designed. There's a way that ayahuasca also teaches us that the effects of our actions are always designed to bring us back to agency. They're always educational. They're always merciful. The universe is set up like an amazing teaching experience, but it can get really difficult. It can get hellish before we will really open our eyes and really exercise choice to choose something that's loving and peaceful. But that reality comes through in ayahuasca right away as well. You're not your body, you're a spirit soul, and your choices really matter. They have real consequence. And then, to me, the next and sort of simplest realization, this is not really simple, I guess, but is also that you have a very vivid sense after a number of ayahuasca ceremonies, sometimes even in your first ceremony, that the universe is endless. That this creation is, you can't circumscribe it with your mind, first of all. You can't possibly fathom it. And that it's endless, and that there are endless realms and experiences that you can have, and that those experiences are directed by your desires. What do I want? What am I seeking? What am I looking for? And that those are directing you into bodies and into planets and into, it's like a passport. Your desires are like a passport that are sending you all over the place. And that's a kind of cosmic realization that often comes in ayahuasca ceremonies. But again, it's actually really, really basic. It's like sometimes in an ayahuasca ceremony, you'll just have this realization that there are like an infinite number of planets, and there's just, it's like there's spirit worlds, there's more like dense material worlds there, but it's like vast. It's like New York City. Do you know what I mean? It's just, you can go, there's tons of different stuff going on in this universe, and your desires take you in places. And then another experience that you have in ayahuasca ceremonies is people will often have the experience that wherever you go, the same basic problem can still exist, which is that you are looking for something that you already have. That you can go to the farthest reaches of all different kinds of dimensions of consciousness and planets and heavenly realms and hellish realms. And in all of those places, one of the guiding forces behind desire, when it's taking us around unconsciously, is that we're looking for something that we already are, that we already have, and that no experience in any realm can satisfy. So you can go anywhere looking for anything in all different kinds of places, and none of those experiences will give you what is already inside of you. At the same time, you become more and more aware of the fact that in order to be connected to what you really are, to who you really are, to that love that exists at the core of your being as a spirit soul, connected to this amazing divine whole, that you need to live in a certain way so that that connection stays alive. So it goes back to the choices. But it's sort of like there's a time in ayahuasca experiences where we start thinking, it's kind of like a sci-fi novel or something. Like I feel like there was a stage, I remember specifically a long stage that I went through where I got really excited about exploring. Like, where can I go? What what dimensions and civilizations and all of this stuff. And ayahuasca kept bringing me back to this thing that was like, yeah, there's lots of places to go, but it's much better to go wherever you're going, seated in your heart, like go in the spaceship of your heart. Do you know what I mean? Like, because otherwise you can have all sorts of experiences in all sorts of places, but they keep trying to deliver the same message, which is like the best way to have any experience is to be back in that eternal space of your heart. So to me, that's like one of the most profound realizations that I ever had, because then then you have some sense of where to guide your choices, right? Why? Okay, I have choices, but what are they for? What am I trying to do with my choices? And the answer that ayahuasca, I think, gives to people time and time again is you need to use your choices to find a way of staying deeply seated and connected as in your heart with the divine that you are, with the divine that's transcendent to you, that's immanent within you. You gotta stay there and build it and grow it. And you can go anywhere with it. But it's a total trip, and very scary to go without it. And I think that was sort of the distillation of the teachings that came over a very long period of time for me anyway. So that's where I come to the takeaways from the talk that I wanted to give tonight, which is, okay, so if those are some of the basic things that come out of ayahuasca experiences, regardless of what the particulars are that we're healing, the blocks that we're clearing, the traumas that we're coping with or whatever, if it still keeps coming down to the real healing, the real truth is the love that you are, that's in your heart, the love that you're connected to in the divine. If that's the ultimate thing that heals, then how do I stay connected to that every day? What are the choices that I can make every day to stay connected to that? So here are some of the things that I've learned about that. One is that we have to have devotional practices in our life every single day. It has to be, if we want to be in the heart, then we have to have a heartbeat. Heartbeat is rhythmic. A heartbeat is regular. It's like a fire that you're tending every day. In order to make our connection to the divine alive and something that guides us through all of life's ups and downs, a spaceship heart that can take us everywhere, it has to be tended every single day. It cannot be neglected. It's like a little child. I have a 4-month-old at home right now and a 3-year-old, right? So I'm learning how to become a dad. And I'm thankful that I have a devotional practice, because it's like being devoted. My experience, it's like devotional life is like being devoted to a little child. It is something you have to care for and hold and cherish and be very good to. Keeping it alive and warm within yourself every single day has to be the most important thing. I know sometimes it's very hard to think about any kind of practice or regiment or sadhana becoming the center of our lives, because we don't want to be regimented. Do you know what I mean? But if we can think about devotional life as tending the fire of the heart and keeping it alive, keeping the love connection between ourselves and the divine alive every day, I think that what the idea of practice does, or regularity or consistency, is it says there's going to be days where I'm going to want to fall asleep. There's going to be days where I'm not going to want to do this. There's going to, those are the days where some discipline, some consistency, even when you don't want to do it, that's what it's there for. But it's not discipline, spiritually speaking, in the sense of like some sort of regimented thing that will take you up a stairs to some ultimate realization. Do you know what I mean? It's about, how do I cultivate love in my heart and connection to the divine in my heart? And I have to do it every day to keep it alive, because this isn't a final destination. This is who I am, and this is something that is eternal. So to keep it alive is a choice that we repeat eternally. In a human life, it's in a human body, it's very hard to do that without some regiment, some discipline, because there's going to be times where we're really not going to want to do it. So every day, what I recommend to people coming out of the ayahuasca experience is that if you've had an ayahuasca experience, it's very blissful and healing, and you're basked in a kind of golden, you feel like you're held by the whole universe in some ways, and you come out of those healing experiences. That experience is not unique to ayahuasca. That experience is the glow and love of God. And that experience is available to all of us all the time, every day. So at any moment of time, we can be in that space, but it takes cultivation. So whether it's daily prayer, meditation, yoga, walks in nature, journaling, whatever you do to have that private, sacred, intimate space, you know what I mean? You got to find a way to do it, and you got to keep it alive. It has to be a fierce love. Has anyone here ever been so in love with someone or something that you couldn't stop thinking about it at all times? It just consumed you. Maybe you were 18, I don't know, but has anyone ever had that experience before? Okay, so in a sense, that's what our spiritual life has to be like. We're not, sometimes people, we think that to have a spiritual life, we need to exercise detachment, right? Well, in order to be spiritual, I have to be detached. But that's not actually the way that the spirit soul is. And I think ayahuasca teaches us this as well. The nature of the spirit soul is to want to connect. That's why the word religion means in Latin religio, which means to reconnect, like ligaments that are connecting. The word yoga means to yoke, to bind, to bring together. The natural disposition of the heart is like, my phone's always looking for a Wi-Fi signal. Do you know what I mean? Well, our hearts are the same way. They're always looking for authentic connection to other hearts or to other heartedness. So, but if we're not providing it with a signal to connect to, if we're not fiercely in love with our spiritual practice, whatever that might be, whatever connects us, if we don't have fierce desire for it, it easily goes to sleep. We easily fall asleep again. And then what happens in the ayahuasca world is that people think, I need to drink more ayahuasca because I've got more blocks. I've got more problems. My energy's not straight, or my chakras need cleansing. I need some gemstones. Do you know what I mean? And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with any of these things, right? Sometimes chakras need cleansing, and like gemstones really help and stuff like that. But also, like, if you don't have a daily, just fierce love for your spiritual practice, then it's very easy to fall into the medicine, turning from medicine that's nudging you toward your heart to something that is a crutch. And it's a very real thing that happens for a lot of people, including myself. That's why I actually backed away from ayahuasca after 10 years and took a sabbatical, because I wasn't doing my work. I wasn't cultivating that practice, which ayahuasca kept telling me again and again and again and again. Like, this is in you. You know what I mean? Like, this is in your heart. It's not just you drink this cup, it clears you out, you feel good, you stay high for a little bit, and then, you need another cup in a couple of weeks or whatever. This is something, the ayahuasca, why is it clearing things? Why is it eliminating things? Why is it purging things that block us up or that keep us hindered? It's doing so always with the guidance of like, okay, back to the heart center. Isn't it warm and beautiful here? How do we keep it alive? Let's do it, team. You know what I mean? Like, let's do it. So whatever that is, I feel like that's really what we have to, every ayahuasca ceremony, if it's not leading to a little bit more intense, sweet love, then, really it's not doing its job. And we really have to take that part of the responsibility of it. That's our part of the task. Sort of like, you have to remember that this tradition, ayahuasca, comes from indigenous people and places on the planet where the respect for elders is a really, really big deal, right? And teachers is a really, really big deal. And grandmothers you know what I mean? And we really, so this is a teacher. And when the teacher gives us a gift or teachings and lessons, and we don't listen to it, there's a price to pay for that in our souls, in our psyche, in our consciousness. And that's what I'm saying when I go back to the idea of being very careful that ayahuasca doesn't become a numinous cultural phenomenon. Do you know what I mean? But that when it's like, if you have an experience with ayahuasca, one of the most reverent things you can do is to say, I got the homework. I'll wait to come back until I've really tried to put it into practice, and then I'll come back. Like, that is the hardest thing to do with ayahuasca. For me personally, I'm talking about someone who drank in like over 100 ceremonies in 10 years. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of ayahuasca. And I kept going back because I loved the experience, but it took a really long time for me to realize that I needed to take the teachings of the experience more seriously than the experiences. Do you know what I mean? So I wanted to say that because not because it's like some universally applicable thing, but because each of us, as people who participate with the medicine, also end up carrying our own medicine. We carry the medicine and the stories and how it interacted with us. So some people have totally different experiences with ayahuasca and different wisdom and different lessons to share. So I don't mean to act like having the final word or something. I mean, remember, I'm a preacher's kid, so I'm going to go for it. But you know, but I do think that the unique lesson that I've been given has been about you know, these things that I'm talking about the need to take the lessons home, to create a home in the heart from the experiences. The other thing that I want to mention in terms of a spiritual experience, I said I would talk about this, and then I'll end and we can have some Q&A if you guys want, is there's also very basic physical things that are needed, that the ayahuasca teaches us, very like first ceremony, right? If you're in a ceremony and someone starts talking about the news, how does it make you feel? Like if someone were like to start chatting like a CNN ticker and you're in an ayahuasca ceremony, like how would that make you feel, right? The point is that actually the same information affects us in the same way outside of a ceremony all the time, right? So everything that affects you in a ceremony affects you outside of a ceremony. It's just that the volume is turned up really loud in a ceremony. So, you know, your music has to change if you really want peace in your life sometimes. You know, what you take in media, how much media, social media, what kinds of friends you have, what kinds of people you surround yourself with. What do you read even? Again, not to use corny cliches, but the world around, we're very sensitive and we're very porous, even though sometimes we feel like tanks, you know, and we just go forward through things. That's not how our heart wants to get down with us. You know what I mean? Like our heart wants to get down with us. Like, how do you really feel? Do you know what I mean? Let's really slow down and take it in. And in order to really open the heart, we have to be so careful about what we're putting into our minds and bodies. Incense in your space after you have a difficult conversation can be a very simple way to just kind of return to that sweet spot. You think about what shamans are doing in the midst of a ceremony when they're giving you a benteado or something like that. They're cleansing your space. Air. So I didn't realize that I didn't use a ceiling fan in my office, even though I had one, right? So all summer long, I'm sitting in the hot, like suffering with just a little bit of oxygen. Do you know what I mean? There's a simple ayahuasca realization, like air helps. You know, like breathing helps, like doing breathing exercise, like so many very, very basic things that we can do. For another example is this. Lots of sugar in your lifestyle will make your mind go faster. When your mind goes faster, you can't feel. When you can't feel, you get confused. When you get confused, you get angry. When you get angry, you do things impulsively or too quickly, and it just poops in the swimming pool. Do you know what I mean? So that's a simple thing, like too much sugar jacks most people up. Or other simple things like, for a lot of people, I'm not saying everyone, but for a lot of people, alcohol does not work. It just doesn't work. For some people, they can handle a little moderation here or there, maybe. But for a lot of people, they may have addiction in their genes, or so to speak, or they may have past life karma that goes to extremes with things. But for a lot of people, alcohol is not something that's going to work. It's going to, over time, it's going to dull your consciousness. It's going to keep you from your heart not open it, even though it may feel at times like it's opening it. That's a really simple truth that comes from ayahuasca. Another simple truth that comes from ayahuasca is sobriety is radical. People don't always value or estimate the sobriety. People think, I mean, just today, I read this online. And I'm talking about all kinds of sobriety, right? Like someone said, I'm going to have my healer told me that I should be having right now, in order to get my money karma back in the right place, I should be having 4 to 6 orgasms per day. I was like, you need a new healer, man. Like, that's not cool. Because here's the thing is that like in all traditions, whether it's Ayurveda or Chinese medicine, like your life force, it can be exhausted, even through something as beautiful potentially as you know, loving sexual connection with someone. But still, like our bodies are sensitive, you know, like that. It's a big experience to make love, and it can be very draining, even though it can be a very good thing. So most mystical traditions around the planet, we get really high levels, they're not having sex. Shamans in the Amazon, when they're training for ayahuasca, they're not having sex. Do you know what I mean? It's like you say that nowadays. If I were to say that, I'm on social media right now, so I can, maybe people will comment and I'll have a shitstorm to deal with later, but it's like completely taboo to suggest a little less sex in life. People will go off on you as if you're trying to repress or kill their spirit or whatever. And yet one of the very first teachings that I got from ayahuasca was like, dude, a little less sex, you'll feel better. And I did, and I do. And it's not that sex is bad. Do you know what I mean? But just like having a clear state of mind that doesn't have a lot of input coming in, a lot of stuff going out. It's like you're, you know, we're like ponds, you know, you throw a bunch of rocks in, there's going to be a lot of waves. This is something that's very, very basic. For example, if you were to have an orgasm in an ayahuasca ceremony, did you know it can kill you? Yeah. So be very careful. I mean, so maybe you were thinking of going off, but I'm just saying, like, it's very important that coming out of an ayahuasca ceremony, you also take very, very seriously that the sensitivity that you feel in your body in an ayahuasca ceremony, where like any little thing is really potentially a big thing. That's actually how you are all the time. Your heart feels things that you are not consciously aware of in your mind all the time. And so shifting our environment and what we put into our environment and around us is very important. Now, there's a teaching that goes along with this, comes from the Bhagavad Gita. It's very important to me personally, is that there's a big difference between eliminating something out of the desire to renounce in a repressive attitude and the desire to naturally tune ourselves into something higher. So along with this it goes like this. It's not just eliminate all of this stuff because it'll mess you up, but rather develop a higher taste. Do you know what I mean? Develop a taste for things that are higher. And then naturally, it's like this. If you give someone a lot of kale in an otherwise really unhealthy diet, they tend to start craving healthier food. You guys have heard this before, right? This is actually scientific. So if you start adding healthy things, actually nutrient-rich food into a person's diet who has a really crappy diet, they'll naturally start craving less crappy things. So similarly, it's not just eliminating things from our life to keep the sort of vibe alive after an ayahuasca experience. It's also adding things that are good. That's the main way to start naturally reducing the things that aren't good. Because you also want to raise your sensitivity so that you can feel more like you do in an ayahuasca ceremony. So that you're saying, oh my gosh, like having the TV on, even though it's in the other room and no one's watching it, is really affecting me right now. Like, you know what I mean? Like, some people are very sensitive. They'll get that right away. They don't even need ayahuasca to deliver that experience, right? But for a lot of people coming home from ayahuasca experience, it's like if you add a little daily meditation into your life, a little daily prayer, something like that, and you just stick to it for like a month or two, you'll pick up on things like that and you won't want the TV on. Do you know what I mean? So those things naturally fall away. But a lot of the times we're not ready in life to let things fall away before we're ready to let them fall away. So there's also this very interesting dance we have to do with our egos, I guess you could say, where it's like, it's like leading the bull to water. You know what I mean? It's like, if you just yank, it's just going to be like not going anywhere. Like, but if we are very patient and very careful and we kind of gently bring the bull along by giving it some of what it wants and then guiding it, whatever, then it'll go to the water. So similarly, we have to be really patient and really loving for whatever parts of ourselves are tugging in the direction we shouldn't be going. If the universe is going to allow us an infinite passport to go around and explore our desires endlessly, always trying to bring us back to our heart with infinite patience. That's the model for how we should be with ourselves when we're trying to come to the heart. Do you know what I mean? It's the same model that we should use with ourselves. So, of course, there's endless things that we can do to add to our life that could bring this in. But I wanted to make that point clear, because sometimes when I talk about this practical portion, I have to be really careful, because I think sometimes, again, we can actually re-traumatize ourselves by trying to be like, I'm a spiritual ninja level 10 before, do you know what I mean? Like there's no use in that. So you'll go into the ayahuasca ceremony and you'll puke out your fake ninja level 10 persona. Do you know what I mean? Like, no, and then that's like a really dark trip. So nobody wants that. So you get it. So at any rate, that's where I want to leave things, and just return to the basic thing, which is that all ayahuasca experiences in my 10 years came back to the very simple thing, which was your heart is the best place to be. In your heart exists a loving relationship between yourself and a divine that you can't even fathom. And you're in a unique spirit soul that's part of that divine, and that relationship is the best place to be. You can go anywhere and it's all good, no matter if it's up or if it's down, if it's heaven or if it's hell, if that relationship is alive. That's the most important thing. And to me, everything about ayahuasca beyond that realization has been about how to keep that relationship alive, how to develop it. So thank you very much for listening.
Nice. We have questions now. Do you want to stream it? That's up to you.
Yeah, I'll take questions. I won't say any of your names. If is that okay? No one can see you or anything. So okay.
So I'm going to ask the first question while I.
Okay, great.
Get 3 numbers out.
And thanks to everyone online for listening.
So when I read your book, the one thing I really wanted to find out was, when you go into an ayahuasca ceremony, your opinion of what God is most likely going to change. Meaning you're going to have the I am God type of effect that, hey, we were all connected.
Right.
You went in the ayahuasca ceremony with a very closer relationship with Jesus.
Right.
That maybe most of us here did.
Uh-huh.
And not only that, but your father, because I read the book, your father was struggling with that as well.
Yes.
So
yeah.
In the book, you did mention you saw a vision of Jesus, and I got the sense that your opinion of Jesus, of what he represented, actually was strengthened, because I thought it might be destroyed. So that's my question.
Yeah. Yeah, and the very first ceremony, the book is sort of a slightly fictionalized view of the whole experience, because I studied creative nonfiction, which is sort of like making true stories into novel form. Well, it's like you're writing a movie script for your story. So in the book, I tell it a little different than it actually happened. It's very close to how it happened. Basically, the experience was of seeing Jesus walking on water. It was a downpour that was happening in the right outside of the mesa, and in the space of the medicine, just the way that the water was coming into all of my vision was very, very powerful. And I had an image of Jesus walking on water, and a lot of insights that poured in. So I summarized those in a more of a scene dialogue kind of way than it actually happened. Because as you know, if you had an ayahuasca experience, you may see something that speaks a million words. Do you know what I mean? Or you may see something that speaks and delivers things that are very precise, but it's not necessarily a voice. So it's hard to explain. But the impression that I had of Jesus was of someone who was a fully, I don't know how else to put it. I'm going to have to use cliches, but someone who is a fully realized embodiment of just incredibly intense, passionate love of God. And I'm very open to different ideas about God, right? Ayahuasca, I think, delivers very clearly that there are many different ways to approach the divine in this in this world. So, but for me, the language of Christianity was very apparent. Now, I have friends who are Buddhists who went through experiences, had profound experiences that were more intimately related to their path with Buddhism or something like. So I think it's varied for people. And the language that I use, I think, does come from my Christian background. Still, I think it does. Now I'm a student of Bhakti Yoga, so it's just very similar, though. Bhakti Yoga's sort of ultimate goal is not even a goal, it's just unmotivated love of God in the heart, and just that sharing in that, living in that space. But that's came in my life, searching for that, some more some way of practicing that. Bhakti Yoga came into my life through the ayahuasca experiences. But the connection with Jesus was like, here's just a fully realized person who came and just preached a message of total love. The first greatest commandment that Jesus taught in the Gospels, when they asked, what's the greatest commandment? He said, love God with everything you've got. And second to that, love everyone else. Love yourself too, like that's the summary. So I feel like every single idea about Christianity that had ever been imparted to me, whether it was about atonement or guilt or sin or anything, about the meaning of the cross, or just all of that was just completely annihilated by having an image of Jesus as someone who was about love, just love. And no, sir, nothing else, just love, and that like, it really just totally sort of set something on fire inside of my heart. It returned me to my Christian faith, but also just, destroyed the walls of the church that were also, keeping me in some ways from that faith. Not to say that that church can't deliver that connection either, but for me, it was an impediment. Do you know what I mean? So now, like, I very gladly will go to Christian worship services at different times of year that are still very sacred to me and get a lot out of it. But, for me, like, love of God is something that ultimately, there's nothing you can do to institutionalize or, you can't institutionalize it. It's something that exists. It's either you're doing it in the heart and it's real, or you're trying to, or, you're not. And that's that simple for me. So, these experiences of Jesus that I write about in the book were just basically kind of being like the whole of the Christian teaching is love, and kind of eliminating everything else that's a distraction, if that makes sense. So yeah, that was a good question. Thank you. Did it answer?
It does.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. The number is a book raffle at the end.
Beck, yeah.
So you had ayahuasca in Peru and in New York City and maybe many other places. For someone who's never had it, would you recommend going to Peru for this experience because you need to be in the jungle, like I heard people say, or, I suppose, I'm not going to Peru, but how do you recommend?
Yeah. Yeah. I always kind of laugh when I think about funny when people say things like that. I'm always thinking about like, it'll also dip its toe in you, just so you know. I'm just kidding. No, this is a really good question, and it's, first of all, I have to be honest. Like, I don't think there's ever one answer to these kinds of questions. You know what I mean? So like, my answer is, if you can go to the jungle, go to the jungle, because my first experience was in the jungle, and I think it was radically different than experiences in New York City. I got a lot more out of my experiences in the jungle, although I know it's like sacrilege to compare ayahuasca experiences. But the truth of the matter for me is that the jungle experiences were by far the most profound, because I felt that I was connecting to, how has anybody ever had a car break down on them and get stuck somewhere for a while? Raise your hand if that's happened. Okay, so some people, you're stuck in a place for a while and the genie of the place suddenly appears. The place moves from being some place that you accidentally got stuck in to being like a place that you developed a little bond with, and the spirit of the place kind of emerged. Well, I feel like all places are like that. This room is like that. Like everything has a spirit of the place. And there's kind of, in my experience, there's kind of a way in which the spirit of the place you're drinking will make an appearance. This room, if you were to drink ayahuasca, would become something very different than what it appears to be right now. Do you know what I mean? And like, to me, the genie or the spirit of the place in the Amazon, there's just nothing like it. It's so freaking awesome. It's so deep, and the plants and the trees and the birds and like just everything is really powerful, and it's where the medicine came from. Do you know what I mean? So like, to me, there's no substitute for that, but I don't rip on people for doing it elsewhere. Otherwise I wouldn't have had so many healing experiences in New York City. Like the bulk of my experiences were in the United States, but something like 20 to 30 were in the jungle, right? Those experiences still, though, were the most powerful for me, and I attribute that not necessarily to the strength of the medicine. In some cases, it was much more powerful in the jungle, too, but more so to the spirit of the place that comes out in the jungle. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think you were next, yeah.
I would like to know why having an orgasm on ayahuasca can kill you.
Well, I think it has, I actually, this is something a shaman told me my first time in Peru, and I didn't listen to him after. He said it even, not during, of course, but he even said afterward while you're dieting, it can kill you. So this was some advice that I received, and he said like it can really jack you up because your energy is very low and the medicine's still coursing through your body. I think it changes your blood pressure after you have an orgasm. I think things like that, and it can be dangerous anyway, was what was imparted to me. And I didn't listen to him because I had a bit of an orgasm addiction when this is my very first trip to the jungle. So remember, I'm like a couple months out of doing opiates still. I was a pretty young guy. And I'm just going to be totally honest because I think it's an interesting story. So I decided to go take care of myself in my room while I was dieting. And I basically fell into a stupor for almost 30 hours. Yeah, I could barely move. My energy completely like went out of my body, and I was just like leveled. And I was too ashamed to tell anyone what I had done. And I really, really suffered. And during that state, it was like being in an ayahuasca state all over again, even though I hadn't drank the medicine had sort of seemed to have left my body. And I was like, oh, I feel fine, you know? And that space was a very clear teaching for me about that addiction, that piece of the addictive behavior that I had. When I got home, I started researching a form of sexuality that's called carezza. Carezza is orgasmless sexual union with your partner. It's a little tantric in the sense that it's non-goal oriented sex, right? So I became celibate or practicing non-goal oriented, non-orgasmic sex for 5 years after that. And it completely changed my life. I still consider something my wife and I have talked about publicly a few times before, but like my wife and I didn't sort of consummate our sexual relationship in that way for over 2 years after we were first dating. And I still consider the intimacy that I built with her in that form of lovemaking to be far more profound and building of a bond between the two of us. And whereas previous to that, orgasms in relationships had, for me, and I'm not saying this works for everybody, but for me, it had the effect of immediately distancing me emotionally from the person that I was with, not being as interested in them, maybe even being interested in a novel sexual partner after orgasm. A lot of men deal with that. Sometimes women not as much, according to certain studies that have been done that I've read about, that, you know, I could point you to them later if you're interested. But anyway, I didn't want that experience any longer either, where I couldn't maintain the same level of interest or desire for a partner because the spark had worn off, right? And the medicine specifically was like, you just need to have less of that goal-oriented sex, where it's actually about your climax, your pleasure, and it's not about building something sacred with the other person. As I went through the ayahuasca experiences and went through diets where celibacy was also required for a long period of time, and I was also celibate, meaning no sex outside of these particular Karetsa experiences with a loving partner, that over those 5 years of doing that, I also clearest mind, my skin cleared up, like very, very radical level of improvement in my health and my mental states. So that was what I was taught initially from the shaman that I worked with in Peru, and it's had a big impact on my life. Now, I don't think people, again, you cut orgasms out of your life, it can actually make things worse if it's not, you know what I mean? Like how many spiritual movements have been like, oh, I got to be celibate, and then that just creates crazy kinds of problems. You know what I mean? So I'm not advocating anything like that, but I do tell people that if you look at the Dalai Lama, if you look at Thich Nhat Hanh, some of the greatest examples of glowing spiritual effulgence in our world, Thomas Merton, some of Mother Teresa, the great examples that we've had, often at very high levels of spiritual realization, sex does go out. And I think we need to be a little bit more open about that can be an okay and beautiful thing, even if we're not ready for it. We don't have to go and make a whole philosophy about how it's all or nothing. You either are throwing tantra parties and celebrating the sacred sex life, or you're totally celibate. Do you know what I mean? Like, we can also exist in a space where, like, we try to deal with our desires in healthy and loving ways, while also realizing that, a couple of pieces of pizza is okay. A whole pizza, sometimes you don't feel good afterward. Like, it applies to basically anything in life. So, yeah. Good question.
So will you shaman tell you after 30 hours too? Old you?
No, I didn't tell him until I got home. And then in the email I wrote him when I told him about what had happened to me, because I didn't have to look him in the face and say it. Then he said, I told you. So, yeah. Back there, yeah.
So I found your whole summation of like ayahuasca teachings like really concise and well thought out. And it's been 4 or 5 years since I've had an ayahuasca experience. I'm probably about to have one in like a month or two. And it's exciting, and I'm fucking terrified, man. I mean, I am.
Yeah.
That's all I think about. I wake up and I'm like, wow, this is happening again. But I'm also really excited, and I just wonder, other than, I imagine everything you said about how to integrate the experience afterwards applies to how to prepare for the experience.
Yeah. Oh, preparing for the experience.
You would add to, like, in terms of.
Yeah. That's a great question. How to get the most out of an experience, how to prepare for it. Well, you have to sort of say the obligatory, like, there's no way you can be prepared for it. Like, everyone says that, and it's true. But I think minimizing, it's sort of like, has anyone ever been in one of those? I've never been in one, but have you anyone ever been in one of those, what are they called? They're like, it's like you go into the water and you float, and you can't, a float tank or something like that. Has anyone ever been in that before, one of those before? You were? Okay. Aha. Okay. Wasn't picking up on this image for some reason, maybe. So, okay, well, I imagine that in an experience where suddenly all stimulation is gone, you would want to prepare for that by sort of toning down stimulation before entering. Because otherwise it could be really jarring to go from 90 into like, I'm floating in nothing. Do you know what I mean? So similarly, I think that in an ayahuasca experience, you're preparing for a very high level of sensitivity. The deepest, most profound places that you can go in ayahuasca are actually when you're able to stay centered in ayahuasca. So one of the things you learn how to do over a course of a long period of time in ayahuasca spaces, whether it's the daime or anything else, is you learn how to sing along with the shaman. You learn how to keep the chakapa rhythm, or you learn how to dance in the daime, or so there's an anchor, right, for the experience, and you stay centered with it. That takes a long time to really cultivate being able to stay upright, to not be in a bucket, to hold and not vomit. It really, and a lot of times in the beginning, it's natural and very important to do a lot of purging, a lot of thrashing, whatever needs to get out, it just kind of gets out. But over time, what you're really working to do is to become deeply centered, because the medicine goes much more intensely deep when you stay upright, breathing, centered, singing, keeping your mind clear and straight. That's why shamans can hold the space the way that they do, is because they're able to do that, right? So it's sort of like you're trying to become a sort of a place where the medicine can flow through you without it pushing you left and right, right? But in order to get to that space in an ayahuasca ceremony, experience after experience after experience that you have, as you're going into that experience, you need to think about moving into that center every day, a couple of weeks beforehand, days beforehand, so that you're sort of starting to bring everything into that focus for this intensified space of focus. And first of all, it's very normal to not be able to do a great job of that in the beginning, and to fall out and to barf and to flip out or whatever, because the anartas that we have in our heart from the yogic language, the blocks or whatever, we're unconscious of them. So how can we get rid of them before they're gone? Do you know what I mean? How can we clean house before it's clean? How can we know we don't know what we don't know? But if you take steps like making your diet a little bit more bland, a little less spicy, turning off the TV for a week before you go into ceremony, having time that's quiet every day, just really starting to center into a quieter space, your mind and your brain rhythm, just everything just starts slowing down. The experience is still going to be intense, right? But there's going to be less to contend with. Do you know what I mean? That you've brought in with you. And it's like a good teacher. If you show up to class prepared, the teacher can give you way more than if you show up to class like, oh, I'm just like, I'm everywhere, I don't know what to do, like that. So that's how I would think about it. Mm-hmm. Yes.
You said in your discussion that you found that during this practice it led you to your heart's desire. Do you feel like after you've done ayahuasca, you've been able to manifest things in your life a lot easier?
Right.
Because you desire?
Okay, so so I think this is a really important question. I'll just reiterate it for people who are listening online because it's a really good one. The question was, after drinking ayahuasca, are you able to manifest your heart's desire? Are you able to manifest things more? There's two answers to this in my experience. One is that the first answer is yes, and the second answer is sort of like and we should really be careful about it, because first of all, it's like in yoga, as the yogi is developing that link with the divine, they develop siddhis, mystical powers, meaning they start being able to do things that are interesting. Like, for example, a siddhi that was just demonstrated was you were in a float tank last night, and for whatever reason that image popped into my head as an example to speak to you directly about your question. That's not me. Do you know what I mean? But siddhis, for the practitioner as they're developing, they can tempt us to think, oh, that's my power. That's some special power I've acquired. That's something I've got. Do you know what I mean? There was no intentional, I have no idea where that idea came from. Do you know what I mean? But those kinds of things do develop where you might just have more intuitive ability, or you might think about something and then it kind of comes your way a little bit easier, or stuff like that. But my teachers have taught me sort of very clearly that those are often very big temptations for the ego, to start trying to build an ego on the platform of ayahuasca. It's very tempting, and I can tell you right now that I've fallen victim to it a lot before, and I still do. It's not like like it can happen to any of us at any time, because we all have egos. We're all susceptible to it. But so in my experience, the number one teaching of ayahuasca is, your desires can take you anywhere and everywhere, and you can get good at manifesting stuff. But everything that you manifest comes with a price tag. There's a cost associated with everything, right? So if we desire wealth, or if we desire fame, or we desire a sense of importance, or we desire knowledge, or whatever it is that we desire, ayahuasca can, in a sense, increase just your mojo, just your ability to go get things. And because you have rare insight and knowledge, and sometimes it builds rare confidence in you as well. But I go back to what ayahuasca kept telling me the only true desire worth having really is, and that's love of God. Love of God in the heart, which is it's ultimately more satisfying than any other desire. Just being connected in the heart to the infinite source of everything. How do we cultivate that? How do we make that the only desire that we have? It's unmotivated by anything other than to love God and to be loved by God. If that's the only desire that we have, I think that manifesting things very easily becomes like a small prize in comparison. So I'm very careful about that. It's not to say that I know it's a tricky thing, because I know immediately when you have this conversation, people are like, it sounds really puritanical, like we have desires in life, like don't we have a destiny to live? Don't we have some path to walk, and aren't our desires like sacred or whatever? Again, all I can say is that my experience is that whatever we desire, whether it's like, oh, I'd like to write a book, or I'd like to be a successful author, or I'd like to have a yoga studio, like whatever, like I'm going to have to let go of all of this. Do you know what I mean? Like my yoga studio will crash at some point. I'll die, or my wife will die. The book will be forgotten. Do you know what I mean? Like all of that stuff will go away. But what will remain is me as a spirit soul and my connection to the divine. And so that has to me, like ayahuasca has always kept teaching me that the other stuff is part of my karma, is stuff I desire. My ego is going to get involved with it. I just got to keep coming back to my heart. And the only thing I really want to manifest is love of God. So that's where I stand on it. Okay.
So much of what you shared vibes with my experience, with my learnings from ayahuasca. The one thing that has thrown me off the most is where does astrology fit in?
Right? That's yeah.
That's the one thing I'm completely stunned about.
I know, right? Yeah, that's my karma, I think. I mean, it's I would say that like we all in our lives, like we all have things that we're naturally going to desire that we can't, I'm not saying we can't have any desires or whatever, but we all have desires. So for whatever reason in this lifetime, like one of my desires has something to do with astrology. And you know what I mean? So it's like, I'm like here astrologizing because like that's really cool to me or whatever. But I'm imagining that there's also like 40 billion different kinds of astrologies around the universe, and that there's lots of other people who just really like to sort of grok astrology, and they're doing that elsewhere, whatever. But I don't. So on one level, my first answer is just I'm doing astrology because apparently it's my karma to really desire astrology. But then I think that astrology has really unique role to play in spiritual life. So, right? So but I like to say that part first, because it's like, I don't want to I think a lot of the times we suffer from taking things more seriously than we ought to, right? So I have to be in this place where when people are like, so why are you doing astrology? That I can't take it so seriously that I think it matters more than, my grandpa who was an electrical engineer, or do you know what I mean? Like whatever. So I have to say that first. But then astrology to me is really interesting because basically, astrology is a language that teaches you about karma. So a birth chart, for example, is a snapshot of the sky at the moment that you were born. It shows you where all of the planets were in relationship to where you were born. And then the gist of it is that when you come into existence, the picture of the planets at the time of birth tells us something about your individual karma. The stuff that what are your desires? What are you going to be doing? What are you going to get into? What are you going to get lost in? Whatever. So having that knowledge to me, alongside of the sort of spiritual message of ayahuasca has been.
Unfortunately, they got to come in and do something, which normally isn't the case. I was going to wait till about 10 up, but they're.
Oh, okay.
Something they have to do.
Okay, I'll just finish this thought and then we'll be done. so I talk about this all the time online in my astrology programs and stuff like that. But basically, astrology, the planets were called grahas by the Indian astrologers, means grabbers. In a sense, the birth chart is telling you all about the person that you're going to method act in this lifetime. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm going to method act Adam, the author, astrologer, like whatever. Like I'm going to go method act that because that's my desire. Well, having that knowledge and having some insight about where that trip is going to take you, the ups and downs, specifically helps you to not get lost in it. Specifically helps you to be like, yeah, this is a Shakespearean play I'm in. Do you know what I mean? And it gives you trust that all the tragedies and all the great gains and all the great losses, it helps you take them all equally. It helps you move through them with equanimity. Yeah. That's why yogis used it too. So, well, thank you everyone very much. So, thank you. Bye everyone online.
Well, Adam